Imagine you are 9 years old. You are sitting in a classroom in Ohio or Kansas or New Jersey. The teacher has just told you to get under your desk. You pull your knees to your chest. You cover the back of your neck with your hands. You press your face against the linoleum floor. It smells like wax and chalk dust. Outside, the sky is completely normal. Birds are probably flying. Someone's mother is probably hanging laundry. And you are crouched under a school desk, practicing for the end of the world. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday morning. For roughly 40 decades, tens of millions of ordinary Americans lived inside a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of a distant war, not the fear of economic collapse or illness or crime. This was the fear of annihilation, total, sudden, civilizational annihilation, the kind that gives no warning and leaves nothing behind. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that takes a moment to absorb, is that people built their whole lives around it anyway. They raised children in it. They ate dinner in it. They went to work in it. They learned, somehow, to treat it as background noise. This is the story of how that happened. In August 1945, the United States ended the Second World War with 2 atomic bombs. The relief was real. The celebrations were genuine. But something had changed that could not be changed back. The world had changed, and everyone who understood what atomic weapons meant knew there was no going back. For a few years, America held a monopoly on the weapon. That gave a certain uneasy comfort. Then, in September 1949, a U.S. Air Force weather plane detected something drifting across the Pacific. Radioactive traces. The specific signature of a nuclear detonation. The Soviet Union had tested its own bomb. President Truman announced it to the public in a press release that was almost unnervingly calm. But the meaning was clear. America was no longer the only country capable of ending civilization. There were now 2, and the other held a fundamentally different vision of the world, and the weapons to back it up. The Cold War had a new shape, and ordinary Americans were about to feel it in their schools, their homes, and their basements. What followed was a government effort to prepare civilians for the possibility of nuclear attack. But that created an immediate problem. The truth that a Soviet nuclear strike on an American city would kill hundreds of thousands instantly and leave the area uninhabitable for years is not the kind of truth that produces calm, cooperative citizens. It produces panic. So the government found another story to tell. In 1951, the Federal Civil Administration released a short film. It featured a cartoon turtle named Bert. Bert wore a pork pie hat. The film was called Duck and Cover, and it played in schools across America for the better part of a decade. The premise was simple. If you see a bright flash, you duck and you cover. You get under a desk, you get against a wall. You shield your eyes and protect the back of your neck. Bert the turtle demonstrated by pulling into his shell. The narrator spoke in a calm, friendly voice, the same tone you might use to explain how to cross the street safely. The film wasn't entirely wrong. In certain scenarios, a wide enough detonation, a sturdy enough building, getting low and covered could improve your odds. But the gap between what the film implied and what a nuclear attack would actually do to a city was enormous, wide enough to be almost cruel. Children didn't know that gap existed. They just practiced. Schools ran the drills regularly. A bell would ring in a specific pattern. Teachers would instruct students to get under their desks, face down, hands clasped behind their necks. Children who had no real concept of what a nuclear weapon was learned the position the same way they learned to raise their hand before speaking. Some were frightened. Some thought it was exciting. Some thought it was silly. Most just did it, the way children do what adults ask, without needing to know why. But some asked why.
and parents had to answer. That is one of the stranger features of this era. The conversations that happened at kitchen tables, in cars on the way home from school, at bedtime. Parents trying to explain something they barely understood themselves, trying to be reassuring without lying, trying to prepare their children without terrifying them. Some parents said it was just in case. Some said it was very unlikely to happen. Some changed the subject. Most did some version of all three. There were families that stocked their basements, canned goods, jugs of water, first aid kits. The government encouraged it. The Federal Civil Defense Administration distributed pamphlets listing what to buy: crackers, canned meat, dried milk. Enough for 2 weeks. Enough to survive, the pamphlets implied, until things settled down, until help arrived, until the emergency passed. From a distance, it can look bizarre, but it was also a way of coping. They had titles like Survival Under Atomic Attack and Facts About the H-Bomb. They were written in plain, practical language, the same tone you'd use for hurricane preparedness. They described blast zones and thermal radiation and fallout. They explained how to decontaminate your skin. They were distributed through schools and post offices and civil defense offices, and they ended up on kitchen counters across the country, as though nuclear preparedness were simply one more household responsibility. They were also, in their way, deeply surreal documents, because they were built on the premise that nuclear attack was survivable, that it was something you could prepare for, like a bad winter, that the right supplies and the right attitude would see you through. That wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't the whole picture. The whole picture was too dark to print in a pamphlet. The physical landscape of America began to change. In cities, yellow and black fallout shelter signs appeared on buildings. They marked basements, subway stations, the lower floors of large structures, places where people could theoretically take cover from radioactive fallout after an attack. The signs carried a specific symbol, 3 triangles inside a circle. If you grew up in an American city during this period, you saw those signs constantly. They became as ordinary as fire hydrants. Most people stopped consciously seeing them within a few years, which was in its own way the point. Some homeowners built shelters in their backyards, concrete rooms underground, accessible through a hatch, stocked with supplies and a battery-powered radio. They were sold in catalogs and featured in magazines. Life magazine ran photographs of smiling families posing in their backyard shelters as though showing off a new patio set. But the shelters raised questions that families rarely discussed out loud. Who would you let in? If a neighbor knocked on your hatch after an attack, would you open it? What if opening it put your own family at risk? What if there were children outside? These weren't hypothetical questions for everyone. They were practical ones, and ordinary American families were quietly working through those scenarios, alone, without telling anyone, in their kitchens and living rooms, across the country. The fear was not constant. This is important to understand. It did not sit on people every single morning. If it had, it would have been unbearable. People would have stopped functioning. Instead, the fear settled into the background. It became part of the texture of the era. It lived underneath things. People went to drive-in movies, they bought new cars, took vacations, watched television, worried about their mortgages and their kids' grades. Life was full and busy, and often genuinely good. The nuclear fear did not cancel everyday life, it coexisted with it. Psychologists who later studied this period described it as sustained compartmentalization, the mind's ability to hold 2 contradictory realities at once, to know that nuclear war is possible and also plan a birthday party for Saturday. The knowledge doesn't vanish, it gets stored somewhere that doesn't interfere with daily life. People who grew up in this era describe it differently depending on who you ask. Some say they barely thought about it. Others say they thought about it constantly, especially at night. Some say the drills felt routine, just another thing you did at school. Others say the drills were the first time they truly understood that they could die, that the adults around them expected they might die, and that the adults didn't have a real answer for it. Nuclear fear had a particular quality that separated it from other fears. Most fears have a face, a specific danger, a direction, a source you can name. This fear was faceless. It could arrive without warning from anywhere, on any ordinary morning. It made no distinction between the guilty and the innocent, the important and the unimportant, the adults and the children. That randomness, that totality, that was its particular cruelty. And yet, people had breakfast, people drove to work, people had babies. By the mid-1950s, the bomb had become almost domestic. Atomic imagery showed up in advertising and comic books. Las Vegas promoted itself partly on the spectacle of nuclear tests happening 60 miles away in the Nevada desert. Tourists gathered on hotel rooftops to watch the detonations. Hotels advertised atomic cocktail parties timed to the blasts. The mushroom cloud appeared on postcards. This might look like a culture that had lost its sense of scale, but it was also coping. When you cannot escape a terrifying thing, you sometimes absorb it. You name it, you sell it, you make it familiar, you make it almost funny, because confronting it fully every single day is not something the human mind sustains for long. The monster films of this era, the irradiated beasts rising from the ocean, the giant insects spawned by atomic testing, were never really about the creatures on screen. They were about what those creatures represented, the thing that was easier to watch destroy a model city than to think about directly.
The sirens were something you heard before you fully understood them. Civil defense warning systems were installed in communities across the country during the 1950s, tested on regular schedules. A steady wail meant air raid alert. A wavering wail meant a more immediate threat. In theory, every American was supposed to know the difference. In practice, most people stopped thinking about it after a while. But the conditioned response never entirely went away. People who lived through this period described that involuntary pause when they heard the test sirens, a small internal stop, a half-second of attention, and then, this is only a test, go back to what you were doing. The emergency broadcast system interrupted radio and television throughout this era. The tone was distinctive and slightly unsettling, even when it was only a scheduled test. Most Americans heard it hundreds of times during their lives. Most had the same 2-second reaction every time. Attention, a held breath, then the familiar words, "This is only a test." How many times did Americans hear that phrase? And how much of the psychology of this entire period is compressed into it? The rehearsal of disaster, followed by the reassurance that this time it isn't real. This time you can go back to normal. Until one time, it didn't feel that way at all. October 1962. For 13 days in October 1962, the word rehearsal dropped out of the equation entirely. American reconnaissance photographs had revealed that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missile launch sites in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The missiles could reach Washington. They could reach most major American cities within minutes of launch. President Kennedy went on national television in the evening of October 22nd. He spoke for 18 minutes. He showed the photographs. He described what they meant. He announced a naval blockade of Cuba. He stated plainly that any missile launched from Cuba would be treated as a Soviet attack on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. Families sat in front of their televisions and watched him say those things. The next morning, people went to supermarkets and bought everything they could carry, not in the organized civil defense pamphlet way, in a panicked way. Canned goods, bread, water, anything. Lines formed before stores opened, shelves cleared within hours. Gun stores reported sudden surges. Some schools sent children home. Churches filled on weekday mornings.
In Washington, people who worked in government offices noted that the streets felt different, quieter, more watchful. People were looking at the sky. This was not the managed, well-rehearsed fear of the civil defense films. This was the real thing breaking through. All the drills and the pamphlets and the yellow shelter signs suddenly felt like they had been pointing towards something real, because they had. Children noticed that their parents were different that week. They couldn't always name what was different. Some noticed that dinners were quieter. Some noticed that bedtimes were more careful, that parents held on a little longer when they said goodnight. Some noticed that television stayed on much later than usual. In Tallahassee, a father built a shelter in his basement during the first week of the crisis. He worked through the night. In New York, a woman wrote in her diary that she looked out her window on the morning of October 24th and thought about every person she could see from where she stood and whether they would still be alive in a week. In Los Angeles, a teacher told her class on the first day of the crisis that she loved them. She had never said that before. For 13 days, ordinary Americans were not practicing. They were waiting. And then it ended. The Soviet ships turned back. A diplomatic arrangement was reached. The missiles came out of Cuba. The supermarket shelves were restocked. Game shows came back on television. But something had shifted. Americans had felt the full weight of what had always been there, clearly, without insulation, without abstraction, and then they were asked again to fold it back into ordinary life. Most of them did, because that is what people do.
The years after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought some genuine changes. The Limited Nuclear Test Treaty was signed in 1963, ending atmospheric nuclear tests. Those tests had been releasing radioactive material into the air for years. Scientists found it in soil, in rainfall, and in the teeth of children. A nationwide study had been collecting baby teeth donated by American families, measuring concentrations of strontium-90, a byproduct of nuclear detonations. Parents who sent in their children's teeth understood, in a very direct way, that the Cold War was not an abstraction. It had been settling into their children's bodies. The test ban was a real relief. It didn't end the arms race, but it removed one visible, measurable sign of it. Through the mid-1960s and into the 1970s, public attention shifted. Civil rights, Vietnam, assassinations, political upheaval. The nuclear fear receded from the center of the culture's anxiety. The missiles were still there. The shelters were still in the basements. The fallout shelter signs stayed bolted to buildings for years, for decades, long after the crackers inside those shelters had gone completely stale. But the duck and cover drills faded from schools. The pamphlets stopped being widely distributed. The yellow and black signs became part of the background, faded and unread, present without being noticed. Then it came back. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought a sharp new chill. Reagan-era officials spoke openly about limited nuclear war scenarios. Public health researchers published findings showing that no hospital system in any American city could handle the casualties from even a targeted nuclear strike. There was no civil defense plan that actually worked. There was only the plan on paper. In November 1983, ABC broadcast a film called The Day After. It depicted a nuclear strike on Kansas City and the weeks that followed. More than 100 million Americans watched it, one of the largest television audiences in the country's history at that point. They sat in their living rooms with their families on a school night and watched Kansas City burn. Grain silos, highways, suburban neighborhoods, gone in minutes. They watched survivors moving through a recognizable American world that no longer functioned. The network set up mental health hotlines after the broadcast. Schools sent letters home advising parents on how to talk to their children about what they had seen.
President Reagan wrote in his diary that the film left him deeply depressed and more committed than ever to reducing nuclear weapons. Children who watched that film with their parents described the silence that fell over their houses afterwards, the particular not knowing what to say, the sense that something had been confirmed that everyone had always been told was unlikely. Some could not sleep. Some of their parents could not sleep. And the next morning, people got up. Parents made lunches. Children went to school. The Cold War ended in ways nobody had fully predicted, and faster than almost anyone expected. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991. The framework that had organized the world for more than 40 years came apart within a few extraordinary months. For Americans who had grown up entirely inside the Cold War, which by 1989 was most of the country, the ending was disorienting in its own quiet way. Obviously, it was a relief, but also strange, like a sound you had lived with so long you stopped hearing it, which you only truly notice when it stops. Fallout shelter signs came down from some buildings. Some stayed up, unnoticed, part of the walls they had been bolted to for decades. The backyard shelters were converted to storage or sealed shut. Families who had maintained supply kits for 30 years quietly cleared them out, the crackers long expired, the water jugs dusty, the civil defense pamphlets yellowed and brittle at the edges. What remained was harder to see. People who had been children during this era grew up carrying something they couldn't always name, a particular relationship with uncertainty, a practiced habit of holding normal life and catastrophic possibility in the same mind at the same time. Some of them became more comfortable with anxiety than people who hadn't grown up under that shadow. Some became less. Some carried a low background dread that didn't have a clear object once its original object was gone. The parents who had raised families through these decades had done something genuinely unusual. They had built ordinary lives inside a permanent condition that could never quite be called an emergency, because calling it an emergency every day for 40 years was not compatible with functioning. They managed it by not managing it, by putting it somewhere that didn't interfere with the baseball in the backyard and the church on Sunday and the birthday parties and the mortgage payments. They had done what people often do with the unbearable. They made room for it and then kept living around it. From a distance, it is easy to flatten this history. Up close, it felt very different. It was not heroism exactly. It was something quieter, the stubborn insistence of daily life on continuing, the refusal of the mind in most circumstances to be fully consumed by its worst knowledge, the way a Tuesday morning in a classroom still smells like chalk and floor wax, the way children still put their faces against the linoleum and cover the backs of their necks, and then the bell rings, and they get up, and they go to lunch. A whole society across 40 decades learned to carry an extraordinary weight by treating it most of the time as ordinary. That is how people absorb the unthinkable, not by resolving it, not by defeating it, but by folding it into the everyday until the everyday and the unthinkable become, somehow, the same thing. That is what this era was. That is what millions of American families actually lived. And the fact that it eventually ended, that the sirens became routine, and the shelters were forgotten, and the fear slowly faded into history, does not make what those people carried any smaller. It just means they carried it long enough to put it down.